My career started with Elixir, but sadly that didn't last very long because that team folded in a little over a year and I ended up on a Go team instead. And I hated it. I just could not enjoy Golang after spending a year working in something as beautiful as Elixir. I ended up moving to the front end for a bit to help with the rewrite of Twitch to React, finding that fun enough and diving in deeper and deeper until suddenly I'm a React YouTuber, I guess. I don't know. I still love full stack. I still love Elixir. I play with these things all the time and I want to talk about them more and I want to use them more. And maybe, just maybe, I want to ship them more. Sadly, I've not had the chance, but someone else has. Just a couple days ago, developer Daniel Bergholz tagged both Prime and me in an article they wrote all about moving to Elixir after spending a bunch of time going through React and eventually burning out. I wanted to take the time to read this blog post because it seemed really cool. So let's do it. From Next.js to Rails, then Elixir. My journey through React.js burnout. I've been a web developer since 2019. I used React and React-based frameworks like Gatsby, Next, Remix, Astro, and Hydrogen. I've never been fully content with any of these tools, but as a beginner who was deep in the JS ecosystem, all I could hear from my peers was something along those lines. This is the way any other programming language is either slow or old. Interesting. I personally never would have phrased things like this, but I've definitely seen people that would do that. I can see why you would feel this way. I'll also say, you have experienced more React frameworks than me. I've shipped Gatsby once for a blog. I tried using it for other things and hated it. Obviously, I'm pretty deep on Next. I won't pretend otherwise. Remix, I know of well enough, but I've never really shipped it. Astro, I love. I use it for a bunch of random things. And then Hydrogen, the Shopify framework. Interesting choice. Clearly, you really wanted to try everything, and I have respect for that. But I can see why, if you're still building up your own confidence in these skills and trying to solve problems, how this type of hopping from thing to thing could be really stressful. Let's see where we go. As a result, I got used to a huge amount of complexity, multiple separate repositories, thousands of libraries and frameworks to achieve simple things, GraphQL, microservices, serverless, static sitegen, incremental static regeneration, partial hydration, Redux, Redux Thunk, Babel, Webpack, React Server Components, server actions, etc. This list could go on for another 10 minutes. Redux Thunk, God, this poor individual, the thrashing here, I'm so sorry. Until one day I said, enough is enough. Let's take a look at the complete timeline of me slowly going mad. This will take a while. Feel free to make some coffee before the long read. The timeline of the burnout. Part 1, Gatsby.js. I remember finishing my bootcamp and thinking, finally, I'm able to build my portfolio. And so I did. There's only one small problem. I wanted to index on Google, but using the good old Create React app made this mission nearly impossible. Soon I learned about SEO and React's hydration cycle, which led me to the solution of this problem, Gatsby.js. The idea of static site generation was simply revolutionary for me back then. After all, nothing is faster than pre-rendered HTML files, right? He's not wrong. We'll see where this one goes. I'm well known for not loving Gatsby, and I'm curious what his experience was like. I decided to learn this new framework by reading the docs, and let me tell you, this was not a fun experience. I've never heard of GraphQL before. Apparently, you needed it to generate all the static files. What the hell? Yeah, your instinct here was correct. We went down the wrong path, and I'm so sorry you had to come down this whole path with us. I asked some of my internet friends if having a hard time learning all of this over-engineered crap was normal, and they replied with, skill issue, try harder. I promise you I would not have replied with this, especially at the time. So I tried harder, and after finally learning it, I ported my personal website to Gatsby. Most of my pages were successfully indexed on Google, and for a couple of months, I was extremely satisfied with the result. Then another problem appeared. A lot of my developer friends started saying, Gatsby is dead. Next was created to simplify static site generation and also provide server-side rendering. Fair. I would also have to see, when did this person graduate their bootcamp? They've been a web developer since 2019. Yeah, you came in at one of the hottest points for everything being reinvented. I firmly believe we're in a better state now than we were in 2019. Whether or not everybody's complaining more or less on Twitter, different issue. The straight up level of thrash is way lower than it was back then. So let's see how his Next experience went. Took a quick glance over at Next and immediately fell in love. I was able to do the same things as Gatsby without GraphQL and with a third of the code. Once again, I ported my portfolio to another framework, Next. This time, I had a wonderful experience. Deploying to Vercel was a breeze. Get static props and server-side props functions were simple, yet extremely powerful. I could choose the rendering style per page. A lot of flexibility. Unfortunately, something I learned the hard way, JavaScript ecosystem, all good things come to an end. This is a great intro for the Remix chapter, but I do want to quickly say, get server-side props was not what I would call simple. It had some very weird and dumb complex behaviors that were best avoided. And the relationship between these functions and the content actually getting to your components was also not clear. It was simple in the sense that it looks good in a screenshot, but it was incredibly complex in the sense that using it and maintaining it was difficult. If you were already used to complex maintenance from something like Gatsby and the chaos of their GraphQL layer between, just deleting that layer feels really good. but removing the thing between these two parts doesn't magically bridge the gap between them. And I don't think Next did a great job. I would actually argue that this developer did a great job bridging that mental gap themselves. For them to digest what these functions did and the relationship of all of these parts in Next after coming from Gatsby quickly enough that it's 2.5 paragraphs. It sounds like this developer did a really good job of onboarding here. It took me longer to get used to Next, and I never would have said these functions were simple. So credit to them for figuring that out so quickly. Let's figure out how this Remix tangent went for them. I remember extremely well when Remix was announced. Multiple tech influencers started publishing content about it, as always. Come on, man. Okay, I get it. Here I am publishing content about your blog post. However, back then, I read on the homepage that it did not support static site generation, just server-side rendering. So I thought, wait a second, all those years investing on the Jamstack is thrown away here? No way, this framework ain't gonna last. However, to my surprise, not only did Remix survive, but it was acquired by Shopify and emerged as a prominent competitor to Next. Create Remix is still the way you create a Remix app, right? The fact that Create T3 app so consistently competes with Remix for app initializations suggests that it's not really a competitor to Next, especially when you look at this. So yeah, sure, if you use Twitter to figure out which frameworks have the most traction, Remix seems to be doing great and be a real competitor. But if you look at any real stats over any real time frame, you'll start to see a pattern. And that pattern isn't that Remix is doing great. This is not meant to throw shade at Remix. This is meant to throw shade at the people who have misled newer developers into thinking Remix is as valid a choice for production software based on adoption as Next. Next won. That doesn't mean you have to use Next, to be clear, but it means you shouldn't just follow what Twitter says. You should have a reason you're using Remix instead. The reason for Remix isn't it might compete with Next. The reason for Remix is it solves specific problems you have that Next doesn't solve well. That's it. Anyways. So yeah, the Shopify acquisition isn't Remix blowing up and doing really well. It's Remix hopefully finding a place that it makes sense in isolation because Next won everything else. After a couple of months passed, I decided to give it a try. And once again, I was surprised. The main motto of Remix is to use the web fundamentals and not an overly complex caching system like Next. So the mental model I needed in my head when coding Remix was 10 times simpler. No global state, just the URL. Fewer client-side states, move all the logic to the server, and use cookies. Going full stack without a REST API in the middle is super easy. Just move your database queries to the loader function. I'm curious if this goes into server components, because this seems like they would actually really like server components. Leaving the matrix. Then, out of nowhere, the truth was presented to me, and I took the red pill. Multiple questions started emerging in my head. Isn't Remix just like all the other old and boring frameworks like Rails, Laravel, and Django? We've been doing the full-stack web development with server-side rendering for decades, but the JavaScript mafia decided collectively that the approach was trash, and moving everything to the client was the future. Did the same mafia decide that Rails was right all along? And doing all those over-engineered monstrosities with JS frameworks was not the right move. I started questioning everything. This new way of doing web development was a lot simpler and faster. Interesting. Very interesting. The person who wrote this is very interesting to me because it seems like their ability to pick up on things quickly is very refined, but their historical context isn't quite deep enough to appreciate why we had this back and forth. Like referring to the JavaScript mafia, like we did these things for reasons and those reasons were good. Backend was blocking us constantly and we needed really good, powerful interactions on the client side. As web developers, we were constantly restricted and blocked by the backend teams using things like Rails, using things like Django, using things like GraphQL. And these new solutions let us break out of that and provide better experiences to our users. There's a reason that we had the back and forth as much as we did. That said, let's figure out what your experience was leaving behind these things. I'm done with Next and Vercel. I reached my tipping point with App Router. Here's a comprehensive list of everything wrong that Vercel is pushing to Next. Oh no, I was liking this article and this is gonna... Oh no. Don't tell me you think that server-side props was a better way to do... No, we're not going to get along after this. What once was simple, the get static props and get server-side props functions now became complex and cumbersome. Currently, there is no specific place to add your API calls or database queries. You can write them wherever you want. We started mixing the business logic with UI once again, after making the same mistake with PHP multiple years ago. You don't have the historical context here, bud. You're doing so well. You're doing so well. Do front-end developers not learn from the past? What happens if I delete a button? You started developing in 2019, my guy. Yeah, you quit at like the worst possible point. Yeah, someone just said in chat, it feels like you have the separation of concerns brainworm too. God, I understand your experience was bad, but you haven't even said what's worse here. You said that putting it other places is bad. Your front end should be 100% trashable and replaceable. No, absolutely not. No. I cannot fathom how anyone has this take in 2024. Our UIs are why we are building our backends more often than not. Like, what? I have to pull chat. I feel like I'm going insane. Should front end be 100% disposable? Yes. Meh. No. Yeah, we'll come back to this poll in a second, but I cannot, like that sentence is going to make it much harder for me to read the rest of this in good faith. Nothing that someone puts a lot of work into should be treated as 100% trashable and replaceable. There are so many people who have dedicated their entire careers to making incredible front ends, and those front ends need a back end that works for them. And as someone who's spent a lot of time on both sides of the stack, you can't just treat one side like it's disposable. Let's see how the poll's doing. 27% said yes, but most people lean men to no. Yeah, the lesson we're learning right now, and this is like an industry-wide lesson, is that treating front-end and back-end as these huge separate entities sucks. And the result of that is we get these huge unnecessary layers in the middle, like GraphQL. And I don't think that's better. I really don't. And as someone who has moved a big company to GraphQL, no, I don't agree with this. The competitive advantage you have against your competitors is the business logic, which should be completely isolated from the UI layer. Okay, common misconception here. The ability to put something somewhere is not the requirement of putting something somewhere. React giving you the flexibility of putting things in different places does not mean everything falls apart immediately. The same way React broke us out of MVC on the UI, React server components break us out of this idea that your data comes from one place and React is a different place. Specifically, this idea of your logic just being hidden all over your code, that can happen. Sure, that can happen in almost anything though. A really important blog post I would refer to here that I have a whole video about. To anybody who feels this way or doesn't quite understand the point I'm trying to make, I highly recommend reading this blog post, specifically the section around data access layers. Next and Vercel do not recommend you just leave random database calls all over your app. They explicitly recommend you take a place in your code base like a data folder, do all of the stuff there, and export things to be used in your components. So the component here would be profile equals await get profile from the data folder. Quickly want to show the poll results. I'm surprised 25% of people agree. Regardless, the majority of developers do not feel the front end should be treated as 100% disposable, and it's crazy to think people do. And this solves the problem really well. Really well. The ability to take your core functionality of like the way your data works, put that in a folder somewhere, and then reuse it everywhere. As long as you have TypeScript, you're fine here because you'll have these responses be type safe and you'll get an error if you make a change somewhere that breaks something somewhere else. It works great, especially when you compare this to how things work in Remix where you don't have these same guarantees. Use loader can return anything depending on what route you're on. So if you have a component that needs data, you have no guarantee that component actually has that data. This is objectively better in the ways that you're saying it's worse. And that's why I'm so confused. It feels like people who don't have the historical context see this form action inlined and immediately get super stressed out about how Next is ruining everything with this co-location. Your ability to do this is not the enforcement that you do this. And it's incredibly frustrating that people think not having one place to put your data means that everything falls apart, because you can still choose one place. Nobody's stopping you from doing that. Anyways. Next is now server first, which doesn't sound bad, right? After all, it solves the SEO problem and shows fresh content to the users immediately. The problem is that most of the existing Next code bases relied on client-side libraries like style components and a couple of global state managers. What does this mean? With breaking changes like this happening constantly, your app becomes legacy software in a couple of weeks instead of years. More time is spent to keep all dependencies up to date rather than doing what matters, shipping features. I half agree on this point. I think Next being so server first had major problems, especially at launch. It was really tough to do things like have a page that fetches some data, but also has a good cached static shell so you don't have to wait for a Lambda to start to see your first bytes. This is part of why I hate get server-side props so much, because it would block the entire page's response on the slowest data fetch you did. The new model lets you suspend things that take longer, which lets you have a response sooner, but that first response was still blocked on a Lambda doing a cold start. So for a marketing page, that sucked. And if you just moved from a vanilla boring Next app with the old page router to a new one using app router, neither of which were doing any real data fetching, the new model would be slower. Thankfully, the introduction of partial pre-rendering combined with streaming makes it better in literally every single sense. So that's the part I would have agreed with before, was that Next having to be on the server for anything to work sucked. I agree. Blocking first byte on a Lambda is bad, but we've worked around it and I'm really happy with the results. And I think your tune will change over time as you see what we can do with these things. As for the things breaking, style components was the big one. Yeah, that sucked. I don't love style components. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm really sad about this loss. CSS and JS was a mistake in so many ways, and we are still paying up like the cost and the impact that had. I would expect to see better ways to server render style components in the future, but I will also say they work in client components still. As long as you're using style components in something marked use client, it behaves as expected still. And that's the same with all of the global state managers. There is very little to any code that broke with this new model. I even have an example in my Bet on React video where I show code from 2014 running perfectly fine server-side with this new model. There are certain libraries that do certain specific things that don't SSR well, but those were a problem with the old version of Next too. So this is a confusing part for me. I agree that Next being server only has consequences, but we've worked through a lot of those. And then the rest, I'm iffy on. The final point here, Vercel hired multiple React core team members from Meta. This presents a serious conflict of interest because these engineers are now, allegedly, shipping features that are beneficial to Next instead of prioritizing the ones that could help all of the React-based frameworks like Remix. Funny enough, I spent a lot of time earlier in this stream planning a response to a lot of the FUD. Here's a great tweet from Sophie, who works on the React core team and notably hasn't worked at Meta for a while now. So they're honestly a pretty good source of unbiased stuff, and they've called even me out for some of my pushback before. They pointed out here, very importantly, that the core React team has 15 people from Meta and 3 from Vercel. 15 from Meta and 3 from Vercel. Also of note is that Vercel didn't poach those 3 in the traditional sense of offering them a ton of money to come over. They chose to go over because they saw a strong future of React on the server, and they saw Vercel as the best place to do that after having tried and failed to work with other people to do the same thing. As I cite in my video, hopefully coming soon, about the history of all this stuff, the earliest versions of server components weren't anything to do with Vercel. They were actually working with Shopify and introducing them to Hydrogen, which actually you should know as the author of this article, because you said at the top here, you're actually one of the 15 people who ever used Hydrogen. So I'm really confused how you can have that take. It feels like you're falling for Twitter really hard. That's my advice to the author here is, honestly, uninstall Twitter and go ship shit, because it seems like you're getting really distracted in a lot of these side quests. And I'm guilty of this too, I'll be honest, but I am very quick to close the app and get to work and ignore whatever the hell is going on when I need to go ship stuff. For the ping code base, we're still using tRPC v9 and Pages router, and that's fine. This post seems like a really talented developer who picks up on things almost too quickly, falling into the Twitter and Reddit hive mind. And that's sad to see, because this is a person who clearly is able to learn things quickly. This screenshot is upset that the React docs don't have a complete detail of client server stuff, and that when you search for React client components and server components, you get Next.js links, not React core team stuff. But these same people complain that there hasn't been a new React major in so long. I feel like you have to pick one between these two. React doesn't want to major stuff that isn't ready just yet. They're taking their time with it to get it right. And Vercel has been willing to bet their entire framework on this opportunity. And the follow-up, I couldn't take it anymore. This is very over-dramatized. And I'm sad because I really liked how this opened, and I see a lot of skill and quick learning ability in this dev, and this is falling apart really fast. Not this video. I couldn't take it anymore. I said to myself, you know what? I'm tired of relearning the same framework over and over again, and I completely disagree with the new paradigm. Not surprisingly, other content creators are going through similar situations. I have feelings on Aaron. He's fine. Obviously, I work with PlanetScale a lot. PlanetScale is a channel sponsor. I appreciate them immensely. He's not a JavaScript dev. He doesn't write JavaScript code. He makes videos about databases, and he likes PHP a lot. If this is a source you're going to looking for anti-JavaScript stuff, have fun. But he doesn't know. Same with these are people who are my friends. I love Adam. Adam's a homie. I get why he made this video, but he doesn't write a lot of React code, and he's never really used Next because he always builds against other people's backends. Yeah, I feel like you were looking for people, but all these people have very different incentives and aren't full-time JavaScript devs. The same way you can find individuals who agree with you online, you cannot find creators who agree with you, even if they don't necessarily have enough context to have those feelings. I'm not saying either of these people are bad developers. I would argue these videos were irresponsible of them. I understand why they did them. It's free clicks, and you get people like this who are fresh out of boot camps following you blindly, but I don't love this. And again, neither of these people were ever heavy JavaScript devs. I would go to people like a Ryan Carniato or a Tanner Lindsley if you're looking for people who are deep on these things that don't necessarily agree with my stance on them. But finding random PHP devs making clickbait videos about why they don't like JavaScript, that's not helping your point here. So the path to enlightenment. The tone here is falling apart fast. TLDR, I was extremely tired. After getting burnt out from all the React tools, my journey for simpler web framework started. Here are the prerequisites I was looking for. Batteries included, convention over config, good developer experience, modern performant front end. Fair. If I had used 5 frameworks in 1 year, I would get it, but I will never love batteries included because they'll never have all the batteries I need, and now I'm doing crazy fucking workarounds. And if it does have all the batteries I need, then it's bloated as fuck. So we'll argue about that, but the rest I can agree with. My first instinct was to take a look at the top frameworks from the Stack Overflow survey. Immediately, I cut out from the list anything JS, C# and Java related. Weird that you're going to recognize the most popular things probably have value, and then you're going to trim out a bunch of them. He never had any desire to learn the last 2. They look ugly and verbose, so the remaining options were Laravel, Django, Rails, and Phoenix. Python is a language that he used during his network engineering degree, and he had a very pleasant experience. Django seemed to follow the convention over config philosophy, but what turned me down from it ultimately was not having a good built-in tool to work on the front end. Most people on forums said they were using HTMX and Alpine, however, both are external dependencies that you need to install. Noticing a theme here? Giving up on Laravel was extremely hard because it had an amazing cost benefit and hundreds of official packages to handle pretty much anything a startup might need, like hosting, auth, Stripe payments, etc. For the front end, they created Inertia.js, a very simple and elegant way of keeping the high productivity and powers from Laravel while using React on the front end. To be 100% honest, the only reason I didn't choose Laravel was because of PHP's syntax. It looked ugly as hell with a bunch of dollar signs and arrows everywhere. I liked this article so much at first, and oh god. And now the Ruby on Rails chapter. Ruby on Rails needs no introduction. It's the OG of web dev frameworks, with the revolutionary build a blog in 15 minutes, which is still impressive to this day. Before I start ranting about all of the problems I found, let's start with the good stuff. Similar to Python, Ruby is the language that you can show to non-technical people and they will understand what the software is trying to do. It is by far the easiest to read and the most beautiful language I've ever seen. I quickly realized that writing visually pleasing code was a priority for the Rails team, and that was new to me. There are things that are readable in other languages too, but yes, I will say Ruby was one of the first languages to prioritize making this easy to read. Not to mention that Rails pretty much invented the batteries included and convention over config philosophies, so it wouldn't be a problem. Inside one single documentation, everything I needed for any type of web app was available. On the front end side, there is Hotwire, a very simple and lightweight approach to all the UX improvements provided by single-page app frameworks. I've always been curious to test the limits of this library. It looks very promising. Oh, Hotwire. On paper, Rails passed all the prereqs I wanted on a framework. Let's try it. First thing I tested was the Rails scaffold command, and immediately I was shocked. One single command generates everything I need for a CRUD app? No way. I don't like code gen. I find that code gen tends to be a band-aid for too much config being necessary for things, and that when you have a bunch of code gen tools and they become the norm in your space, you end up with massively bloated things because you just keep adding it to the template. Once you don't have to write it, you stop caring about how difficult things are or how much code is necessary for them, and you just generate the world away. And that terrifies me. I've worked in code bases with a lot of code gen, and you can never tell if something was generated or if something was written. Therefore, finding intent of design is incredibly difficult. My code gen, like when I'm making a new route or something, right-click new file. I'll never love these scaffolding tools. They tend to result in really bloated code bases. But again, like as a fresh out bootcamp developer, there's no way this individual has enough context to have experienced that. Everything they're saying sounds great. And if you know code really well, maybe you don't have as much history or experience in larger code bases, everything he's saying sounds entirely correct. But I'm promising you, once you're in the industry for a while, most of these parts fall apart quickly. And there's a reason we all have moved off of Rails. There's a reason I helped move Twitch off of Rails and Ember over to Go, GraphQL, and TypeScript. And that's because these problems sucked. There's no code gen on the Twitch app. There's no code gen for most of the Twitch code bases because it doesn't help us move faster. It just results in more code that does nothing. Ugh. Anyways, in Node and React land, to achieve the same thing, you need to manually write all of the code. There are no generators here, and install a bunch of libraries like Vite, Prisma, Express, React Router, Redux, Thunk, Vitess, Cypress. I could trim the vast majority of these, especially if you're already using Next. You don't need Vite, Express, React Router, or Redux Thunk. I'd argue you don't even need Redux. You definitely don't need Cypress and Vitest. You probably need RTL if you're writing tests. Zod, no. TypeScript comes with. ESLint comes with. Prettier, sure, but you should have Prettier in Ruby as well. Like 1,000 different plugins. What are you talking about? You just listed a bunch. And maybe even GraphQL or tRPC. Yeah, optional, but yeah. That's the cool thing though. The level of complexity of your code base goes up and down depending on what you choose to bring in, what you need. You can build an app with vanilla Next, but you will want some of these things to make those specific parts easier. This is also allowed for a level of innovation not possible in these other fields. Like none of these depths are mandatory. Most of these depths aren't even necessary once you're using something like Next. Yeah, don't love that point. I agree with I'll steel man a bit. The point you could make here is that having to decide about each one of these things is fatiguing and sucks. If I am a new developer trying to build a full stack application, I have to pick between Vite or Next or Astro. I have to pick Prisma, Drizzle, or NoRM. I have to pick Express or whatever else. You have to make decisions about these things sometimes. And a lot of people don't want to. A lot of people don't want to think. They just want to code. And Rails is great for people who don't like thinking. I will resist the urge to make more DHH jokes. But yes, you have to make decisions around your code. I don't think that's necessarily a negative. And I would argue your fatigue didn't come from making these decisions. It came from saying yes to every single one of these decisions and then feeling burnt out as a result. Learning to say no is an important skill as a developer. And I don't necessarily feel like this developer's developed that skill yet. And that's sad because they're capable of learning really quickly. That's apparent through this blog post. Having gone through all of these pieces of technology since 2019 is insane. That's like competitive with me. And this is all I do. But he doesn't know how to say no. And that's part of why he's here. Anyways, after the initial shock from Rails scaffold, I was shocked once again when I opened the code from the compiler. Somebody else made a good point I want to point out here actually too, that like the tools for a lot of these things in Ruby and Rails suck. Like their linting with Rubocop is terrible. Go and Elixir have good built-in linting now. They're separate packages, but they're part of the core experience. They come with stuff. Ruby is not a thing you should be highlighting. When you mention ESLint and Prettier, this shouldn't be in the context of them being bad and Ruby being good. Someone who wrote a lot of Ruby, it was not in a good state with these things. Anyways, after the initial shock from Rails scaffold, I was shocked once again when I opened the code from the controller. Oh boy. Def index articles is all articles, show, article find. I wrote a lot of Ruby. I don't find this super great. Like, what is at articles and at article? They're not well defined here. It seems like you're just writing these things and it just works. And yeah, like I know what this is actually doing under the hood. It's just, this is not intuitive. And to that point of like, anyone can read this? Are you kidding? No, nobody can just read this. Is that all of the backend code? Just a couple of lines? That's impossible. It's so simple that it looks like a low-code tool. It's simple, elegant, and extremely readable, which is something we rarely find in the JS world. The next equivalent of this is probably even simpler. This is basic CRUD. One of the major issues this developer seemed to have was that all of the code for all of that functionality was exposed from the UI code. So we won't do that because that sucks. Let's not do that. Look at that. In our template, we already get you started for this. We have the DB with index and schema. We have API. Let's make a new folder named data. And in here, we'll have, what was it, article.ts? Cool. So we'll take a look here. We have posts. So I'm not going to rename this to article because I'm lazy, but theoretically, obviously, you could do that. I won't, but it's pretty trivial to do. Here, I'm just going to copy this so we can be sure we got all of the functionality. And I'm going to drop that in here. Let's go through piece by piece. The first thing we should do, since these are server functions, the easiest way to make these accessible everywhere, the right way, put a use server on top. Don't have to do that. I think it's nice. So now we've done that. We will export async function. Cool. Doesn't know what these things are. That's fine. So we will get them ourselves. Return db. Can I import this? Cool. Look at that. db.query.posts.findMany. Look at that. Here's our index function that returns all of those posts. I would call this get all posts. Cool. Now we have that function. Now let's do the same thing here. Get post by ID. I hate calling this show because this is a magic ID param. Like, where does this come from? Why is this better? I really like that ID has to be provided. Are we using a string or a number for the ID? We're using a number for it. Cool. So we'll say ID is a number. Find first where. I actually haven't used the new query syntax. I mostly just use the old select style. I actually really like the syntax. Let's copy paste that, try it out. Cool, it's not users, it's posts, or we'll say post. In this EQ function, this is how they handle equality. Is this as clean as just passing article.find params ID here? No, but you have way more control of it. And if you know any SQL, this is much better because we actually have this info. You also have the ability to import EQ. So I could import EQ from Drizzle ORM, and I could have post.id ID. This is the exact same thing, where equal posts.id is equal to ID. Now we have get post by ID. Is this slightly more code? Sure. Is this code significantly clearer about where things are coming from? There you go. Cool. Let's do the next one. New. This one is fun because there is a lot of weird implicit shit going on under the hood for that. You have no idea what's coming in here when you have that. So let's make this correctly. Export async function. Create. Oh, look at that. But as you've noticed, this is not all correct. Because I don't think we can create off the query. We have to insert. In here, we have to put in a value. We're not actually using the value we got, so let's use it. Name. Cool. There you go. Now we're inserting a post with this value, A+. Next, create. What's the difference between new and create? How is this obvious? Article equals article.new. If article.save redirects to article, else. Okay, I wrote a lot of Ruby in my time, and I don't know what any of the implicit behaviors for that are. You're going to tell me that this code being auto-generated is like a good thing? Because this is chaos. So according to chat, one is GUI and one is API. Yeah? Wait till you have to debug that. Yeah, cool. So I don't like having a new and a create unless I have a reason to have these different things. Ideally, they would be named accordingly. Cool. Edit. This one will be more fun because in order to edit, articles, article.find params ID, this doesn't do anything. Edit doesn't do anything. What? This is the default that comes out of Rails when you Rails gen. So are all of these just like pages by default off of the article model? So /article /update /edit /create /new /show. All of these are the page. And that's obnoxious. Yeah, I fail to see how this is better. I can demo what that would look like in the new model. So we'll do that after. And I can see now immediately why people would be more frustrated. Edit should come with things like just having this be an endpoint. Like this wouldn't do anything in that default model. So I'm going to skip that because we would need a thing we actually want to do. Update. This makes more sense. Cool. That I can actually do. Export function or async function, update, post. Oh, look at that. Copilot just auto-completed it for me. Something you might notice is that Copilot is actually a much better code generator than a bunch of existing templates. Async function. Again, look at that autocomplete, figuring shit out. Barring the lack of create, because that was a bunch of repetitive garbage, here's our equivalent code. 34 lines, and most of it's because these break out multi-line. They don't need to be async because they're returning a thing that is a promise, but by making them async, you're guaranteed that you'll understand that behavior when you go call it and when you edit the code. Doesn't matter as much, but technically, yes, you could delete the word async from these. The compiler might get angry because they're not async functions being exported, but I just did it out of habit. Doesn't matter. You can await the return. I probably should. No hanging promises and all. Cool. There you go. The one change you could argue for. So let's compare that again to this code, which, by the way, this code is missing so much context. Look at that, 49 lines. It's actually more code than the JavaScript equivalent, even when you include the imports, the use server, and all of the line breaks for these things, and that a bunch of the behavior isn't actually encoded in here at all. And as people are saying in chat, it also looks really similar. Like this is just as readable as this is. I don't get it. And this being auto-generated kind of sucks because the intent of create an update post might be different depending on a lot of different things. Like, do I want to update the date when I update the name? Like, these relationships aren't defined at all. People in chat are saying this is way more readable than the Ruby one. I will admit that we're biased. We're JavaScript devs. This is a non-point, and it's sad to me. Oh, but like, how do you use this stuff? I'll show you real quick. And again, we have all of that awesome type safety that you don't get in something like Ruby that just corrected me here. It would have just let you blindly do post.title and have an error. The amount of little mistakes I've made that have been saved by this are incredible. So here's where we actually use the data. Posts equals await, get all posts. Now we have an array and we can just use it and render. And this isn't my business logic leaking into my UI because it's still imported from server data. So it's still abstracted. It's still separated the way anyone else might want to do, but it's just as easy to integrate in my code. One quick note for anybody watching who thinks that the use server is necessary here, it's not. If you wanted things to be accessible to the client, like you wanted a client to be able to create a post, update a post, and delete a post, you could put use server in those places instead. And the way you make sure these functions never leak to the client is you put import server only at the top, which is a very small package. And by small, I mean it only exists in build. And now, if you try to import these functions somewhere they don't belong, you'll get an error. That's simple. Result, really clean. I just don't get it. Like, this is not better. This also doesn't include any of the UI code at all, which I'm sure we're going to go into momentarily. Obviously, if you stuff GraphQL in the middle, things go to hell. But the beauty of the new model is how clean it makes these things. You can structure it however you want. I understand that this might not have been the structure that was recommended to you before, and that you were frustrated with the ones that you experienced, but you can structure this however makes sense for you. And this is very close to our production code for upload thing, like hilariously slow. So yeah, good experience. I make my point. This is stupid. Just a couple of lines. Yeah, that's all it needs to be. It can be that in any language. Okay, you must be thinking now, this crazy React dev from the internet said he ended up using Elixir, so there must be something wrong with Ruby. And you're right, my anonymous friend. There are some things that annoy me quite a lot. Let's talk about them. First, we need to address the elephant in the room. Moving from React plus TypeScript to a dynamically typed language was not easy. From the moment I started writing code and no IntelliSense or dropdown filled, the code suggestions showed up on VS Code. Yeah, I would also feel blind and lost. I just showed myself having my butt saved by these same tools. It's a terrible feeling. I could make a typo on a function name, and I didn't realize it until the website was in production. I know we can write tests, but this is the type of mistake I want to identify immediately in my IDE, not during test or deployment. Awesome. Starting to learn real production patterns here. Good signs. Another thing I thought I would like, but ended up hating, too much magic. Inside a TypeScript codebase, I can click on top of any class or function, go to the source, and see how it's implemented. On Rails, where the hell do I do validation? Do I create a private function inside the controller? Is there a specific folder for this? Nope. The correct place to do it is inside the model. Why? Because that's how it works. You either adopt the convention or have a hard time writing Ruby code. Got some bad news for you, bud. This is what happens when you include batteries. I simply cannot develop an intuition on how everything works under the hood. I have to blindly trust that the maintainers did a good job at organizing everything. And to finish my frustrations, I started writing front-end code. How do you create components, partials? How do you find the prop types for this component? There's no way to do that. You need to open it up and visually look at all the variables inside. How about doing some interactivity, creating states? Well, there's Hotwire with stimulus, but as you can see, you need to manually create your re-render function. It doesn't figure out a way to re-render the page automatically after changing the state like React. It does not. And again, if it was more open and flexible, people might have added better ways to do these things. But since this is such a batteries included thing, no one really challenges the norms that way. I actually see I believe a Planet Scale employee, this is who I think it is, that uses Rails for their API and Next for their front end. Absolutely. I'd make the argument with the new model that you can use Next for your front end and still benefit from running a server that is the layer that does the fetching back and forth. But absolutely agree, like Rails sucks at UI. Pretty hard. And I will say all of the major Rails code bases I have maintained specifically opted out of using Rails for the front end and use it just for standard CRUD. Yeah, Rails is great if you use traditional CRUD API. As soon as you leave from that, it falls apart. The Elixir experience will be different. I'm excited to see what he has to say about that. Here's an example of some stimulus code, which you don't need to convince us that sucks. It's a miserable experience. Elixir and Phoenix. I have to be honest, I was running low on patience. I tried multiple different ecosystems and I was almost convinced to just stick with Ruby and give up, till a video appeared in my YouTube recommendations. Oh no, is this my fault? Please don't tell me this whole thing that I've been raging about for the past hour now is a path I set him down. Oh no. Oh no. I'm an irresponsible influencer. This is my biggest fear. Anyways. We'll see where this goes. This doesn't make me like the article more. This makes me feel pain. Hold on. Here we can see a React developer saying a bunch of nice things about functional programming, Elixir, and Phoenix Live View. Maybe I should give it a try. I have a lot of nice things to say. Those are really great technologies, but that's not what... Anyways... The first thing I did was open the documentation for Elixir and Phoenix, and I really enjoyed the fact that all packages are documented in the same way using hexdocs. Hexdocs is phenomenal, by the way. If anyone hasn't used hexdocs, take a quick look at the Ecto hexdocs. They're beautiful. And this is all built in the code base for your package. This is generated. Really nice. Hexdocs has a very high bar for documenting the entire ecosystem, which is dope. We have nothing like this in JavaScript, and pretending we do would be delusional. Another good thing is that you can truly learn Elixir just from reading the docs. No need for an expensive course. Oh no, the boot camp is showing. I'm sorry, bud. You learn too quick to pay for courses. This was a choice. You chose to learn the language through a paid course. I would make the argument the reason you didn't pay for a course here is that there aren't any paid courses. I haven't seen any paid courses for Elixir, and if there were some, I'm sure we would probably make fun of them. I don't love charging a fee for someone to learn a technology, and I will admit failure from myself and from the industry that this perception of having to pay for learning resources to learn a technology exists. It shouldn't. I hate the idea of selling access to learning a thing, especially access to being a successful developer. That I hate. I might sell courses in the future, but they will never be to get a job as a developer. They'll be explicitly focused on helping people already in the workforce improve specific skills that the company can pay for, not to learn a new technology. I hate it. And I'm sorry that you've spent so much money on these paid courses. That is a failure of our industry, and you deserve better, Daniel. I'm pumped you found that with Elixir, but I didn't realize paid courses were a theme in your experience, and I'm genuinely sorry that happened. I can see why that specifically would lead you down some of the crazy paths you went down. Then it was time to start writing code. Very quickly, I understood that functional programming is very different from OOP. Let's do a small comparison. Oh no, it's going to show me a bunch of Elixir code. I'm going to miss Elixir more. Oh no. JS, or const object is name, object age 25, Elixir object is this thing, object is math.put here. So the difference here that's important is that we've created a new object when we add this additional field. We're not changing this thing on the left here. Object happens to be bound to this at the time, and we are rebinding object to a new value that's created at this moment. This is not a great example of things being simpler, but it's a decent highlighting of how much your brain has to break going from one to the other. I love the pipe operator. It's one of the coolest things ever. I cannot wait for this to come to JavaScript and TypeScript eventually, someday, maybe. But it takes the result from the previous thing and it passes it as the first argument to the next thing. Really nice. I have a whole video about why I love pipe. Check that out if you haven't already. Anyways, initially, you might find it less readable and more complex, but I promise over time it makes sense. Well, at least it did for me. As a React dev, I got used to seeing multiple functions everywhere. Even front-end components are functions. Not to mention the fact that creating a class is sometimes viewed as a code smell by the JS mafia. It is, but an aside. My brain was already shaped for this new paradigm. It just felt natural to me. Since my network engineering degree in university, I had several classes about object-oriented programming, but it never clicked. I couldn't model complex problems into classes and objects. Using multiple functions to mutate a variable over time is how I model things in my mind. This I fully agree with. This is probably the most loudly I've agreed with the author thus far. I came out of school barely even feeling like a programmer. Like, it was my job. I knew I could make money doing it and I was fine at it, but I didn't like it. It never fully felt familiar to me. I certainly didn't love it. And as pointed out here, OOP is very, very popular in university. I didn't do any functional programming until I graduated from college and I started working at Twitch in an Elixir code base. And I fell in love in days. It was hilarious to me how quickly I went from barely even feeling like a programmer to loving writing functional code. It clicked real hard for me. And I understand these different models click or don't click for different people, but I think I'm really aligned with the author here and we probably think very similarly, which is why it's so painful watching them go down this path. Ugh. Anyways, how about the main framework? Is Phoenix batteries included? Convention over config? Yes, it is. It's important to note Phoenix is very much meant to be the Rails of Elixir. It's very, very similar in many important ways. To be honest, the ecosystem is not the same level as Rails, but it's 95% there. Unless you need an ultra-specific feature, Phoenix has you covered. I was almost sold on Elixir. Two things were missing: good DX and modern performant front-end code. Good DX is a pretty big thing to be missing, and I agree the Elixir DX in your editor is not quite where it is for other things, especially TypeScript. But yeah, that's honestly one of the main reasons I haven't went back to Elixir, is the tooling around writing TypeScript is just so much better. Yeah, and modern performant front-end code. I'm excited to see how he talks about the front-end stuff. Jose Valim has announced they're experimenting with adding types to the language, but Elixir doesn't have them currently, so he got concerned. How do I get IntelliSense and autocomplete without types? Soon I discovered these features aren't necessarily related. After installing the Elixir LS extension on VS Code, I was surprised. It's possible to define a function inside a random module on a random folder, import it somewhere else, and get the IntelliSense and documentation for it. I had those benefits from statically typed languages without the hassle of writing types. Simply amazing. Mostly good. Yeah. Nice that you have these types of tools, but I don't think they go quite deep enough, but they help a lot. There's also this blog post with the set theoretic type stuff. It's really cool. My final concern on the front end was addressed by Phoenix Live View. Fun fact, I'm very likely the first ever production user of Phoenix Live View when we were using it internally at Twitch for managing the marathon content like Bob Ross. It was easier than building a whole front end and API layer just to communicate with those things. We could just update the UI from a server. If you're not already familiar with Live View, imagine if HTMX worked over WebSockets. That's the best quick summary I can give. It lets you update the HTML content of the page via a WebSocket connection between the client and the server. So the client does a thing, tells the server what it did, and the server sends back the new content for the specific place on the page that needs to change. Really cool stuff. It was very early when I consumed it, like way too early, like 2017, rough idea early. But it's in a pretty good spot now, to the point where a newer developer is using it and enjoying it a lot. This is the piece of documentation on the homepage that convinced them. Undefined attribute style for component app web core components table. Real nice. Compiler checks. You can define props to every component, and if the types mismatch, you get an error in your IDE, just like React. How about the UX? Is there a full page load whenever a user clicks on a link? Hell no. Live View establishes a WebSocket connection with the client, as I just said. You get updates via WebSockets. Really cool stuff. Means that rich user experiences like Trello, which used to be very janky, are now super fast. No, that's a big gap. This depends a ton on your network latency, because you don't see the update until the server has sent it. You can't optimistically update on the client with this model. You give up a lot of the immediacy that you get from client-side state management when you do this. There is a loss. We can argue all day over how big that loss is, but having to wait for the server to send a response before you can change the UI is not always a great thing. Since we're using WebSockets for the UI, creating live applications like Twitter takes only a couple lines of code. Building a real-time Twitter clone in 15 minutes. Conclusion. It's safe to say that the perfect tech stack doesn't exist. The silver bullet that solves all the problems is an illusion that we keep in our minds to keep searching and building the most optimized tool. However, at an individual level, the perfect stack does exist, because each developer has preferences and you can easily find a tool that fits your criteria. If you've had a similar journey to mine, perfection might be Elixir and Phoenix. So give it a try. Maybe you'll love it just as much as I do now. If you've reached the end of this post, you're awesome. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope I could bring some value to your career. This almost feels like an all-knowing narrator watching a very talented bootcamp dev go through 15 years of web dev history in 3 years. That's the vibe I get from this, is this person, Daniel, has that like intuition to pick up on things fast, so much so that he sounds like he has 2 to 4 times the experience he does, because he picks up on these things really quickly. There's a bunch of people like this in the community, like someone like Nexel, who's only, I think he just turned 18. He sounds like he's been coding for 15 years, which is insane. And I get that vibe from here a lot. But there were certain gaps and holes throughout. And this piece at the end here, like my immediate thought is, it feels like every one of these shifts, like going from Next to Remix, going from Remix to Rails, going from Rails to Phoenix and Elixir. Each of these shifts happened from like 3 to 6 months from the start. And it sounds like you're still a bit in the honeymoon phase of Elixir. I will argue that honeymoon phase will last much longer because it's a phenomenal set of technologies and it's a phenomenal language. I love Elixir and Phoenix. I genuinely dearly do. But I'm concerned you will realize that just like everything else, it has similar limitations. You'll run into problems and you might find yourself back in React land. I wish you spent the time playing with server components the same way you spent the time playing with Rails. I think you would have been surprised. That's my thoughts on this. There were definitely frustrating points as I read this, but overall, it was a phenomenal journey into the mind of a bootcamp dev. I know a lot of y'all have had similar experiences. I hope that my channel isn't encouraging more people go through this level of thrash, because I've even made videos about why you shouldn't just change stuff constantly. You should be focused on building. I'll pin the video I just did about that in the corner because I really like it and I'm sad it didn't perform as well as I thought it would. So check that out if you want better advice on how to pick technologies. And if you don't want to watch that, YouTube thinks you like whatever's below it. Appreciate y'all a ton. Thank you, Daniel, for giving me this awesome article to react to. See you in the next one. Peace, nerds.